Hi, I'm here with Oren Jacoby, the director of On Broadway. Hi, Oren.
Hi, Kent. Good to see you.
Good to see you. How's everything going today?
Well, it's COVID, and there are how many days till this scary election, but hopefully we'll all come together and get through it.
Right, absolutely. So, first of all, I really loved your film. It was very enjoyable. I found that I was smiling almost the whole way through. And I think one of the experiences a lot of our audience is going to have with this is it brings up your own personal memories of going to Broadway shows as you watch this. I think it's almost impossible not to with all the clips that you have in there. And so, for instance, for me, I was immediately remembering all the way back to when my family lived in Brooklyn for a year when I was in kindergarten.
Wow.
And we went to see Fiddler on the Roof in Broadway. This was around 1970. And so I was wondering, as the director of this, spending all this time with this, I bet you have your specific memories of what kind of first brought you into the theater, what really hooked you with Broadway. I was wondering if you could share that with us.
Well, I was a New Yorker. I grew up in New York, spent most of my life as a kid and teenager in New York. And my father had actually, he ended up doing something else with his life, but the very beginning of his career, he'd actually produced a couple of plays on Broadway.
Hmm.
So they were oriented towards the theater, and I went to the theater as a little kid. And I remember the first movie I ever saw is really funny. It's like very, very vivid. I must have been tiny because I think it came out when I was really, like 2 or 3 years old, but somehow my parents had dragged me to the movie of Carousel. And I have very, very vivid memories of seeing it as a small child.
Hmm.
And that was, I guess, my first exposure to Broadway musicals. And then I think as a teenager, I really grew up loving the great actors in the great plays. And I was very lucky to see, there was a period where there were a number of great revivals of Eugene O'Neill's plays with Robert Ryan played several of them, and Jason Robards played several of these with Colleen Dewhurst in some of the productions. And those were very, very memorable moments of experiencing the theater and falling in love with the idea of you could be transported into this other world. And that's what eventually, and then I guess the biggest for me personally decisive experience I had going to a Broadway play was when I was in college, going to see Athol Fugard had brought one of his or actually two one-act plays to Broadway. Sizwe Banzi is Dead and The Island. And they were two plays that he had produced in South Africa with two South African Black actors, that they'd conceived of these plays and written them together and produced them together, first in South Africa, and then they toured them around the world. And it was about apartheid. And it was really my first exposure to both, the horrors of apartheid, but also the power of art to really engage an audience and make them understand a problem and motivate them to want to do something about it. It was right at the beginning of Americans' understanding about, apartheid in South Africa and what was going on, and realized that the theater could really motivate people to care about that stuff. And so that was for me, one of the most important experiences I've had on Broadway.
Wow. And what's interesting is I can really see how that kind of experience influenced you even as in remembering and watching this documentary, because you really do dive into even the social impact aspect of it. And that really brings me to my next question. There's so much historical information that you have in this film. You have the financial dealings, the artistic development, like even how a chorus line, was kind of first conceived and brought together, the social movements. You have so many artists and insiders sharing their knowledge. It just seems like this would have taken hours of research to put together to even know who to ask, various questions to, who to get these interviews with. How long did it take you to put this together, and how did you put it together? The finished product is just amazing, and it zips along so quickly.
Well, you're kind to say those things about it. I think one of the things about my films that I always try to do is, I don't really want to go to experts and have people telling, outsiders, critics, historians. Sometimes you need something like that to give a perspective or a bridge a gap. But my sort of MO with every film I make is to try to get the the real participants, the eyewitnesses, the people who lived it or were there watching it or somehow involved in it where they had some skin in the game. And we were very, very lucky because of the genesis of this project, which I'll tell you about in a second, that we had we had a couple of very crucial helpers on the inside who were part of the Broadway world and opened up a number of things to make this possible. But the trick is, trying to tell a story, not just give people information. But to me, the challenge was, I'd grown up, I'd watched Broadway. I thought of Broadway as all these disparate elements that were, how do you put, Cats in the same world as, Master Harold and the Boys, a play about South Africa? How do you put those two things together? And yet they were playing on Broadway at the same time. And then in the process of working on this film, I began to understand that there was a kind of ecology or biodiversity about Broadway and the way it works that is necessary to its survival as an institution. And what that depends on is a combination of shows that will make money, that are going to reach the broadest possible audience, and then other shows that the producers and the artists who work on Broadway and the theater owners, as much as anybody else, understand they need to protect an art form. As Jerry Schoenfeld, who was kind of overseeing, although he was no longer living, was sort of the godfather in some way overseeing this film, because it was the participation of his wife at the opening stage that encouraged a lot of people to take part. He was the former owner of ran the Schubert organization. And he used to say, we're competing with sports, we're competing with movies, we're competing with television. All those forums have to do is entertain people. But if you're going to the theater, there's this other expectation. There's this idea that this is an art form and that there's this long tradition extending back to Shakespeare or even to Greek tragedy that we've got to uphold somehow. And we've got to do that, but we've still got to make a buck. So how do you compete? And so the idea that you balance, that you have certain shows that will be new plays, that will push the envelope, which will stretch the audience's understanding of what's happening in their world and make them feel like going to the theater is something that's important and relevant. And then other things which are just escapist fun, or which are, great storytelling, or just, forums for fabulous acting that allow the best actors in America who are maybe movie stars, maybe are not movie stars, they're theater actors, but allow them to come together and work together in a forum where people will come from all over the world to see them.
And the editing, I don't usually comment about the editing that much, but the editing in this film, the way it just moved so quickly I can't imagine how long it took to get it to its final format.
Well, it was, I think, the longest editing process I've ever had with a film. And that was the hardest thing. And it's true because it was, I think, the biggest. I mean, I've tackled some big canvases before. I did a series that was called The Second Russian Revolution that was about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the changes of Gorbachev that we filmed over the final 2 years of his regime. And we were in the Soviet Union and traveling around and filming everything. That was a huge subject. But this, in a way, was a more complex subject because we were covering 50 years of history. We really start the story with the point in 1972 or 1970, you could say, when Broadway was at its lowest ebb, when the attendance was down, when the Schubert brothers, who'd run the industry for, almost a century, had left the scene, or for 70 years had left the scene, and a new generation of theater owners had taken over and realized that the industry was about to die if they didn't do something desperately, take extreme measures to save it. They were really in risk of losing. New York was in risk of losing Broadway completely. And so it was a long editing period, but we went into it really, the hard work was before we started, was breaking it down. What are the pillars that will hold up this story? What are the shows that really mark the transitions where Broadway changed and that set it on the path that it's onto today, where there is this balance? And how did they figure it out? And what were the shows which sort of were so groundbreaking for one reason or another that they changed the whole topography of Broadway? And when we picked those, and then we knew who we needed to get to tell the stories, it was a matter of going after those people. And we were very lucky. The number who did come, either we got the people to be in interviews or we were able to get other documentary materials in a couple of cases for people we weren't able to interview because they were too busy when we were filming because they were in shows or doing movies. But we got a great bunch, not just of stars, but of some of the great legendary producers of Broadway, Liz McCann, Manny Eisenberg, people who've been around since the beginning. The playwrights that we were able to include, the directors, we really were very lucky in terms of the participation we got from Broadway.
Absolutely, and it really came across. I was curious to know, how did you wind up getting involved or being able to cover the early rehearsals through the production of the play, The Nap? How did that come about?
Well, I felt that we were telling a story that was a history, and there was going to be archival material, but I thought to engage a contemporary audience and to make this film feel, like it's of the moment, that we're really talking about Broadway right now. I really wanted to show, also to give people an opportunity, which they rarely get, to go into a Broadway rehearsal room. And initially we had made arrangements with the Lincoln Center Theater was doing a revival of My Fair Lady. And we were very excited to be inside a production of My Fair Lady. And that was going to be, a great Broadway classic that we were going to be seeing brought to the stage in a new interpretation with a fabulous star and a great supporting cast and wonderful designers. And unfortunately, after initially giving us permission, there were issues with the production where they decided at the last minute that they couldn't allow us access to the director working with the actors. So you can come to like the big ensemble rehearsals. And we thought, well, first of all, that would have been too expensive because you have to pay equity, you have to pay all the actors if you film them. For every day that you come in the rehearsal room, you have to pay all the actors who are there. So we realized we had to get a smaller cast. If they wouldn't let us work in the small rehearsals with the key actors, we have to find another production. And although at first we were very disappointed, it ended up being much better for us in a key way, because one of the things we wanted to show about Broadway was that while they're looking to make money, the producers and theater owners need to make money to survive, they are still willing to take risks. Right. There are always plays which, no matter how outlandish the idea seems, are far out. And we thought there couldn't be a more ridiculous, far out, uncommercial idea than a play that had never been done in America, an English play that was about a sport that nobody in America even knows about, called snooker, which is one of the British forms of pool or billiards, but it's snooker, it's different, it's crazy, complicated rules. And this was a play that was sort of a con game that was related to snooker. Which is also a romance and other things. And we just thought I wanted to show that Broadway, even in the midst of its huge success, financial success it's having, because the year we filmed, we didn't know this obviously going into it, although there'd been this trend, it was the most successful season Broadway's ever had. Was the last complete season that ended before COVID, the 2018-19 season. And I wanted to show, that when we started doing the film, people said, musicals are taking over. It's impossible to find a theater if you have a straight play, which is what, a play without music, just it's a drama or a comedy and not a musical. And nobody wants to do them anymore because they're riskier, and musicals can now fit into smaller theaters, because it used to be you needed a huge theater to accommodate the sets and the orchestra. Now they sometimes have the orchestra playing in a hotel room a block away and they pipe it into the theater. So they can do musicals in little theaters. So that meant nobody could find houses if a producer wanted to do a play, there was no place to bring it. So I wanted to show plays still are viable on Broadway, and producers are still willing to take risks on new plays by unproven, without stars. There were no movie stars in the cast. Now, one way they're able to do that is that there are a number of nonprofit theaters now operating on Broadway, which didn't used to be the case. The Manhattan Theater Club, the Lincoln Center Theater, the Circle in the Square, Second Stage. I hope I'm not leaving any out. Anyway, those are the main ones. And they're able to try new plays because they have a subscription audience, which will buy a season of plays. And that way, and they don't need to run for a long time. They're only expecting to have a 8-week or 12-week or 15-week run, depending upon the show. And so they can capitalize what they need to for the support they get from their subscriptions and from their other philanthropic support. So they're able to sustain new plays on Broadway. And we wanted to show that that's a crucial part of this biodiversity of Broadway.
Right.
And that's why we did that play. And we were lucky. We were introduced to the folks at the Manhattan Theater Club, Lynn Meadow,
Mm-hmm.
who I'd met years and years ago, was very open to the idea of us filming. And, you know, it was important. We wanted her to be part of the film because she's one of those figures who's been around Broadway, I mean, through most of this story. I mean, she was already on the scene back in the early 70s when we started the chronology. And she's one of the few women who has been a kind of pioneer for women having an impact on Broadway.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying too, because I do think that if you're local, like, you know, we live on Long Island here, you can find out about the more off-Broadway plays and the more experimental types of things. But for the tourist, I think sometimes those are, you know, they come to Manhattan and they want to see the Lion King, or, you know, they want to see a recognizable name, and so it does create that sense that only the big shows with the big stars are the only things happening. And I thought it was really interesting that you included something that was a little bit more experimental like that. And I think it was also very telling that you see all the work that went behind it. And it was probably a very good play. And yet, for reasons that no one can ever quite identify, in this case, it didn't work. Or
Well,
it
it
just didn't
worked, you know,
sell.
it got rave reviews. The
Mhm,
Times called it, you know, the funniest play on Broadway.
mhm,
Um, but it was a stretch, you know,
right,
it was a funny subject. It was an offbeat thing. And as I say, it was not, you know, it's not something that they were prepping from the beginning where they were banking on this is going to be a big hit.
right,
Um, you know, and perhaps if they put a movie star in the lead, they would have had a shot at that because
right,
people will come to see stars on Broadway.
right.
But the other challenge, I mean, you mentioned that tourists come into town. A lot of those tourists, I mean, we're talking all of this, we've got a big parentheses here. All of this is the world before COVID and the
Absolutely.
world we hope will come back after COVID or when we get COVID under control. But in that world, uh, when in the chronology that we covered in the early 70s, 3/4 of the audience in Broadway were New Yorkers. 3/4 came from either the city or the boroughs or, you know, close to New York, the sort of the,
Mhm,
you know, metropolitan area. Today, that's totally flipped.
right,
Today, 3/4 of the audience are out of towners.
mhm,
Um, and those people come to town. Many of them don't speak English.
right,
So they're not going to go see a play.
right,
They're going to go see a musical where they don't have to follow all the dialogue.
right,
So that immediately, you know, as I said, pushes the traffic towards certain
mhm,
kinds of shows. And as you said, familiarity is an important part of it.
right,
Lion King is part of the world popular culture. And uh, Phantom of the Opera, which is the longest running show on Broadway, I don't think you can go anywhere in the world where people haven't heard of Phantom of the Opera, know what it
right,
is. So there's that name recognition. This is where it started, and this is where, you know, they figure is the home of Phantom of the Opera. They want to come see it here.
right.
Um,
So you mentioned the world Broadway and the world before COVID-19, and then looking to the world after it. I was wondering. I know you've worked on I think you completed a short documentary that covers a little bit of this. I believe you just completed that recently.
yeah.
As someone who, you know, we work in an art center in New York. This is very much on our minds here. This is why our film festival is online this year. Um, how how do you think how can Broadway recover from this? How do you think we move forward from here?
I think it's step by step. You know, I think it's you know, it's going to be slow, and they're going to figure out ways to make it safer for people to come into the theater. They're going to figure out ways for it's going to be safer for actors to work together and backstage crews to work so they can get the work done and be safe. Obviously, as soon as there's a vaccine, that's going to make things much easier. But it's the same thing that's going to be needed for all the things in our society for us to come back. There's going to have to be better testing with quicker results. You know, it's there. We have the capability to do that. My daughter is going to graduate school. She gets tested every week, and they get the results a few hours after they get tested. You know, because they need to keep the school functioning.
Right.
America's got to put the resources. We've got to find ways to put resources so people can get good testing. They can do contact tracing, and then we'll be able to open some of these institutions again. but we have to also wear masks until we do and be careful. And I think it's all, slow ramp up. But I mean, in addition to the short piece you mentioned, the short film I did about Broadway and COVID, which people can see on the New Yorker website, I recently was asked to write an article about Broadway and COVID. I did a little research, and I noticed that I think it was 1603, the plague hit London. Mm. All the theaters in London were closed, including Shakespeare's theater, the Globe. And he was forced to shut down and not work for a while. And then in 1607, it was shut down again because there was a second wave, the way we're now in a lot of parts of this country starting to experience a second wave. They were shut down again. Critically, Shakespeare used the times when the theaters were shut to write new plays. Mm. And during the periods when the theaters were shut, he wrote, Hamlet, King Lear, Macbeth, I think, Antony and Cleopatra. I mean, his greatest tragedies were done under the sort of pressure cooker of seeing people dying all around him. And amazingly, the numbers that died in London during that first wave were exactly the same as the numbers that have died in New York under COVID. Wow. 30,000 people died in London. And so we're going through a terrible setback, and it's really, really hard for the Broadway community. Everybody's out of work. Everybody who was working a year ago is now sitting around trying to find some way to get by. And, the Broadway community is stepping up. The Actors Fund has given out, I think, between $15 and $20 million to support everybody in show business who's hurting the most, can apply to the Actors Fund, and they're helping people get support that they need. Mm-hmm. But it's going to be a slow comeback. You'll notice that the theaters in London have already, a couple of them already opened, that they've figured out ways. They did a one-man show written by David Hare that Ralph Fiennes starred in, and it's only, I think, 50 minutes, and it's in a theater which normally seats 750, but they're only putting 250 in it, so there's like 3 seats between each person. Mm-hmm. And because it's so short, they do 3 shows a night, so they can make enough money to keep going.
Right.
But I'm not sure that's the model, but we'll find creative ways to start it up, and then it'll get easier and easier as the time goes by. I read in the New York Times this weekend that the production of The Music Man, starring Hugh Jackman and Hugh Jackman, who's in our film, and Sutton Foster, that they're starting dance rehearsals, even though they can't get the whole cast together because that wouldn't be safe. They're doing work with the choreography. The 2 of them are getting together in a dance studio and being safe and doing what they need to do so that they can start work. And this is supposed to be the first big Broadway production. People are hoping will reopen Broadway in the spring. Knock on wood.
Yeah. Sutton Foster was at our very last live show where we had the gala for our theater was Sutton Foster and Kelly O'Hara.
Oh, you got 2 of the best. That's
and
I think they're the reigning Broadway divas. They're the 2 best, women in musicals today.
Yeah,
so
they were incredible, and we almost had to cancel that show. They were both real troopers and came out and did it, and we knew that probably the rest of our season was going to be canceled after that, and it had to be. So, yep.
Good luck with your programming. I hope we're all back in theaters by this time next year, if not sooner.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking about the editing and all the material you had earlier. I'm guessing that in the process of putting this all together, you had some great stories that got left on the editing floor, or maybe some stories that were told to you once the cameras were turned off. I was wondering if you had any stories that you are allowed to share with us that won't get you into any trouble, that might leave things on a fun note for us.
I'll tell you 2 stories that I discovered making the film, and that helped our editing, that allowed me to understand this arc that I've told you about, that here was Broadway in 1970. Things were so bad that they were actually talking about, I think the Attorney General of New York put out a proposal that they tear down all the Broadway theaters and make them parking lots. And that was the only way they were going to help the neighborhood, because at least that way people could drive in from the suburbs and work in office buildings. And And, you know, it got so bad that there were, of the 30 or 40 theaters, there were only 4 or 5 that would have shows on.
Oh my gosh.
And we were told, this was a story, this is maybe an apocryphal story, that it's on the cutting room floor because it never made it into the camera. But one of our interviews told us that there'd been a 60 Minutes piece in the 70s where people came into New York to go to a Broadway show. They got off a bus, they went into this theater. They were supposed to come out and walk around Broadway and go to a restaurant. And they were all so scared, they got right back on the bus and went back to Ohio, or wherever it was that they came from. We never found the footage, but that may or may not be true. Anyway, in trying to understand the process of how do we get from there, where things are so bad. And also, you know, we knew that rock music had been part of what had killed Broadway. You know, after the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Motown and James Brown, you know, who's going to want to go see a Broadway musical, which is sort of music you would associate with your grandmother was interested in.
Right.
So that was made it very hard for Broadway. So how did they get from there to Hamilton, where once again, as it was in the 1930s and 40s, when the great era of Broadway musicals of Rodgers and Hammerstein and Lerner and Loewe and all the pop music in the world came from Broadway. How do we get back to that by the time of Hamilton? And in following this story, the two big surprises for me, I mean, they shouldn't have been surprises, but this is what we learned, is one, that I'd always been kind of a snob about Broadway's biggest hits and thought, oh, well, that's the stuff that's the lowest common denominator. That's the stuff that some producer figures out that's what people will buy and will invest in that, and that's what becomes a hit. The opposite is true. When you look, as we did, at all of the biggest shows that broke the mold and had huge new waves of people coming to Broadway, they were all experimental.
Mm.
They were all breaking the mold and doing something that had been never done before. I mean, whether you're talking about a chorus line where you had, you know, no central character, no stars, no plot, basically, just individual stories woven together in this tapestry of music and a moment in life in America, and this little, you know, microcosm of the world of Broadway chorus line members, through to Cats, where you have a book by T.S. Eliot that's poems for children, you know, that with no people, it's about cats, and done in the style of sort of experimental theater, like living theater, or, you know, Grotowski, the Polish experimental thing, where the actors are running around in the theater, in the audience with the, you know, up and down the aisles. That had never been done on Broadway. That had been done in little avant-garde theaters everywhere. So it was this discovery that it was only by taking chances. And that meant that the artists had to be, you know, daring enough to take those chances, but the producers and the theater owners also had to take a risk. And so that was quite a surprise to us working on the film. And the other big surprise was that, you know, I'd heard the criticisms, and there is definitely ground that still needs to be broken in terms of diversifying all the arts in our society. But one of the things that we learned is that the strength, one of the great strengths of Broadway's growing popularity was its increasing willingness to tell the stories of different kinds of groups of people in our world, and have the artists, the playwrights, the actors, the directors, the designers come from different backgrounds, different races, different ethnic things, different sexual orientations. And that Broadway really does, I mean, sometimes it's ahead of the curve. You know, there'll be a play, you know, that talks about AIDS before the rest of society is willing to talk about it.
Right.
Or, you know, August Wilson's plays came to Broadway before there'd been any movies that showed, as his plays did, what the real dramas were of the African-American experience in a sort of from a African-American point of view. Sometimes they're ahead of the curve, sometimes they're late, sometimes they need, you know, to do better. But it's that, you know, tapping into to what America really looks like and what America really cares about that surprised me, that has been such an important part of Broadway's success and Broadway's vitality. So those were two surprise stories.
Yeah. Oren, thank you so much. Again, I'll tell you how much I really enjoyed this film, and I know our audience will feel the same way. And thank you for sharing some time with us and just giving us a little bit more of the background of the story. It was really great.